Okay, so I'll give a quick introduction to Johan. He's kindly agreed to present today about mathematics graduate students instructors, and which was a big part of his dissertation. And I'm really excited to hear it. So the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak here. Okay, so let's get started. Usually I have an outline, but I forgot to do that. So we're just gonna head straight into it. I'm gonna talk about my dissertation. So my dissertation was mostly a narrative inquiry into how math grad students begin to understand what it means for them to teach and for their students to learn mathematics. Because I was very curious about this idea of why do we do the things that we do in the classroom? And that sort of traveled back to this idea of what do we understand what it means to teach? How do we understand what that is? What it means for our students to learn? And then we draw upon our decisions from that understanding. And so, as a proxy to understand sense making and meaning making, I used frames, which is a concept from Goffman. So, briefly speaking, if you're given a situation and you are an individual facing this situation, you're walking into it, you're going to be faced with a
Hey
lot
Joe,
of
I think you have slides, right?
yes.
I'm
Am I
not
not sharing?
sharing them, or at least I can't see them.
I
I
can see
think,
them.
yeah.
Oh,
Do you have, because like Zoom changed, it has like
really?
tabs on the top now, on the top left
Okay,
corner.
sorry. Apparently, I'm just not informed.
No, like I no this is a new update. Apparently you can switch from just seeing the people versus seeing the slides. So can you see it now?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Sorry, but
No,
thanks for helping me with my problem.
no problem. Okay. So, you are faced with like a million bits of information coming at you, like what's the weather like? How many people are in the room? What are you wearing? What are they wearing? What's your job in that situation? And so this mental construct of a frame allows you to filter out all of these bits of information, make sense of it, organize it in a way such that you can make an appropriate response to that given situation. And so I take this general framework, this general understanding to make sense of sense making. So my dissertation relabels these things to be either the situation that they're walking into as they're teaching or their students learning. Like what does it mean for them to teach and what does it mean for their students to learn? And the individual now here more specifically is graduate students instructors. And I use graduate students instructors because it's their first time teaching. Like I mostly looked at people who are teaching for the first time as instructors because I wanted to sort of join them in their journey into developing for them what it means to teach and what it means for their students to learn, which may or might not be related to how they view themselves as learners of mathematics. Okay, so that's my dissertation. Let me click through this. So, how did I conduct this? So again, I joined three graduate students instructors who are teaching for the first time. Their names are Andy, Carlos, and Paul. And just for the sake of us not having to keep track of many things, I'm not going to sort of point out what classes they're teaching, what is it about these graduate students. I just want you to focus that this is their first time teaching and there's three of them, and that there's a lot of support that they're getting, and we can talk about that in a bit. But the data that I'm dealing with here are firstly 5 interviews, hour-long interviews throughout the semester. So one right before their semester. So this was a week before their teaching orientation, where they get professional development from the Department of Mathematics to tell them this is what you're going to teach, this is how you do teaching. There's a lot of this emphasis on what is active learning and what does that do for students? What does it mean to open doors for students? They get to read this passage from Tough from 2014, which is Who Gets to Graduate? And then they have a discussion about it. There's 3 interviews during the semester. This is spread intermittently throughout whenever they found themselves available for an interview. And then one after the semester has ended. This was after their course evaluations have been packaged and anonymized for them to read. And so we talked about that. And throughout these sort of interviews, we were talking about what does it mean for students to learn? What does it mean for you to teach? What do you want your students to learn? So these are example questions that I have. I've also had weekly observations. I was sort of noticing stuff that they talked about in interviews that I am noticing that they're putting in action. or maybe something that they're putting in action that we haven't talked about in interviews. So I bring that into the space where we talk about it. Then I also had them do journal reflections about week-to-week events. This mostly consisted of I wanted to know what are they paying attention to when they deem something as successful? What are they paying attention to as challenges? What's something surprising to them? And what are the goals that they're setting? So this sort of frames this gets me going into the idea of what are they sort of attaching a value to in terms of their development as teachers. And then lastly, right before the final, in between the end of the semester and when we had our final interview, I asked them to do this historiograph activity where they scored their own week to week. This is in retrospect. And I've been asked, why did you do retrospect as opposed to week, like grading them, having them do this throughout the semester. And my answer to that comes from the fact that whenever I think about my teaching, is always in retrospect. I can never completely remember what was happening in action at that time. So then I was motivated to bring this into the research as like, okay, you finish your first semester. I want you to look back on it because before your second semester of teaching, you're gonna think about your first semester of teaching from that retrospective lens, as opposed to the in action, I was feeling this specific emotion. And the other thing to note here is that I had them score themselves. I didn't tell them, oh, you should score it based on how many students attended your classroom, what grades were you assigning, or even like on the side of like you being a graduate student. This was holistically how did they feel week to week, and I asked them to grade it themselves. We did talk about different ways that they sort of what the number means to them, but we can talk about that again later. Okay, so I'm not gonna bore you too much with an analysis because there's just a lot of text going on. So instead, I'm going to talk to you about the design. So for me to report to you what the findings are, because I asked this question of what is a frame of learning, what is a frame of teaching of mathematics, I use a grounded theory analysis. So this is the other thing that I use besides narrative inquiry. And so grounded theory is this idea where you collect, you analyze, then you go back to collection, you analyze. You try to do this sort of funneling idea where you get to focus on something more, suppose, not focus, but like more targeted. So if Andy was talking about, oh, I really like students interacting with each other, or I like to interact with students in smaller groups, I would pay attention to that in the classroom observations and see, she said that in the interview, but is she actually enacting that in the classroom where she's having more conversations in this context? And so this sort of idea ricochets back and forth. And then at the end of the semester, I just do a lot of multiple cycles of coding just to see like what is surfacing in their discussions about learning or teaching mathematics. And so these are the things that I found within these three graduate students instructors. When I ask them about their teaching, whenever they're thinking about their teaching, these are the three things that come up to them. Their role as the instructor in the classroom, their professional knowledge. So this means the content knowledge that you need to teach mathematics. Like, do you know what the content of algebra is or the content of pre-algebra? This is also pedagogical knowledge. Like, do you know how to teach that content? But then it also encompasses this idea of counseling knowledge, uh, being able to sort of help emotionally regulate the students who are feeling defeated in your classroom. And then there's the interactions to fulfill the role that you have as whatever role that you saw. So as an example, one of the graduate students saw their role as being a service provider. Students paid for their class, and therefore they are giving a product that the students paid for. Another instructor saw themselves as sort of a facilitator of an egalitarian classroom. This means that everybody is putting in equal amount of effort and work into deciding what is the classroom environment. Uh, and then the last one was, what was his role? He saw himself as more of a coach, as more of a team player, because he saw the classroom as sort of a game. And so in order for people to play the game, there has to be somebody who is a coach guiding the players along. And then if you ask them to think about what it means for their students to learn, these are the sort of things that they think about. They think about, what do I want my students to learn? What is the intended content in mathematics? what is the intended practices, meaning do I want my students to be working together? Do I want them to working alone? Do I want them to write stuff out thoroughly? Do I want them to discuss, draw pictures, those kinds of practices? And then there's the intended orientations, and this is sort of an umbrella term for me to encompass stuff like self-efficacy, self-confidence, what is it called? Growth mindset. Like, do you want students to learn those things from you? Um, and then again, interactions, what interactions are you doing in order for students to achieve those goals? Do you want students to talk to each other? Do you want students to talk to you mostly? And all these things. And an interesting conversation that came up in the study was this idea of a horizon view. And this was really interesting, especially for the terminal. There was one class where it was a terminal math class that didn't have another math class after it. Students took it. That was their one math class for the degree. But even this instructor was thinking about ways in which how they're teaching and how their students are learning will inform stuff outside of their classroom and outside of college and beyond just that classroom, which I think was very interesting to keep in mind. But yeah, so these are the first chapter, not first chapter, but the fourth chapter of my dissertation was this first research study of what do we think about when we think about our own teaching and our students learning as graduate students instructors? And these were the things that came up. And keep these in mind because we're going to come back to it in a bit. And I will note, this is not an exhaustive list. I have gotten in trouble for talking about this as if it was exhaustive. It is not exhaustive. There's actually something that I left out because it didn't appear to be as salient as these other 7. But so it is completely not exhaustive. There's probably stuff out there that I have not sort of collected. And I don't know if I'll be the person to collect those things. Okay, so let's jump into the second part, the more narrative focus, the one that I really wanted to talk to you about here at our GME. But I needed that sort of pre-context about what frames are. So the goal that I had with this dissertation was to restory narratives, this idea of reorganizing the stories according to some chosen framework about the graduate students' experiences teaching for the first time. And so the process, the sort of structure that I'm going to follow is called the three-dimensional inquiry space. Very appropriate since we are mathematicians, 3 dimensions, R3. So the first dimension is interaction. This is sort of like the personal and social themes that are happening. What are the sort of interactions that are happening in the classroom with the students, with the instructors, stuff that's happening in the personal lives. There's the continuity, this idea of what happened before, during, and after, what's happening week to week. So there are these ideas of connecting between these threads, as opposed to looking at something as just, I'm looking at week 5. What is happening in week 5? It's in context of week 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And then this idea of place, right? We are in observation. I am seeing them in the physical context of this classroom. What is happening? What are they looking at? What are they gravitating to? And I'm sort of seeing these sort of these data that I have to connect in this way. So interviews and observation tie into interactions. The journaling and the historiograph and also the interviews feed into continuity. And so I had this massive data set. And so I was like, I need an organization here. And this is one way for me to get through that sort of restoring process because there's a lot going on. And so the structure that I have for restoring, again, I have a before, during, and after the semester sort of mindset. So in each of these sort of time slots, there are sort of main characters, I would say, of role, knowledge, and interaction. So this ties into those frames of teaching. And I sort of follow along what is happening to their idea of role in the classroom from before they started teaching to during their instruction and then after they finish their first semester and with the evaluation set. Same thing with knowledge and interactions. These are sort of main characters in their story that I'm sort of looking at as sort of changing or maybe shifting, maybe solidifying. And then I use the data to inform all of that. And then I do the same thing, but for frames of learning. How are the things that they want their student, what are the intended things that they want their students to learn, and how do those change? I had one particular example that I took out of this slide. But there was one instructor. Paul was walking into a classroom with the understanding that to learn math is to do problems. Learn math equals do problems. But then they walked into the classroom where you don't necessarily do formula manipulation, symbolic, like pushing around symbols and getting an answer in a like nice tidy box. There was more conversation happening in that classroom because a lot of the problems were like, give me a sentence as the answer. The like the fairness criteria of blank is this kind of answer, or the this algorithm terminates after these many steps. So it's more so like students had to give an answer that was more of a sentence. So this reoriented their sort of understanding of what is intended for my students to learn. And similarly for that class, one of the learning goals was actually to show students that doing math can be fun. And it was a very interesting conversation to have with Paul because that's not necessarily something that you would consider as a learning thing. It's not a mathematical learning, but it was an interesting sort of conversation to have. And so I want to talk about, as opposed to telling you all of these three people's stories that span 18 weeks, I'm just going to tell you the overarching findings that I think are sort of interesting for our group to think about. So across the three participants, they each interrogated at unpredictable times and circumstances one or multiple of these things, these 7 things, like role, knowledge, interactions, intended learning, required actions, interaction, horizon view. They each interrogated one or multiple of these things uh, at random points. I shouldn't say random, unpredictable times during the semester with unpredictable circumstances. So for Andy, she interrogated her role as the instructor and what knowledges she needed in the classroom because students lacked engagement and wanting to leave early. So Andy had walked into this classroom and before interrogation had this mindset that, oh, I never needed to be, what is it called? Structured. I never needed to have somebody tell me that I need to be doing work. I was self-motivated to do the work because this is what I wanted to do. I went to college because this is what I wanted to do. But she noticed that a lot of her students needed that sort of guidance of this is the structure that you need. You need to come to class, you need to be engaged in the class, and you should not want to leave because this is where learning happens. And so this was surprising for her. And so she needed to not just have the content knowledge and the pedagogical knowledge, but she needed that sort of counseling knowledge, that managerial knowledge in order to facilitate students' learning and student engagement. Carlos interrogated interactions that were happening in his classroom because he walked into the classroom wanting students to see him as approachable, as the person that they can come to for help, and sort of be the person that helps them learn the stuff. Um, but then he found in his experience that students didn't want to gravitate to him. Students would rather just talk to each other. And there was one instance that Carlos noticed that this group of female students would nominate this one particular student to be the person that talks to Carlos if a question were to ever be unattainable by them as a group. So they would tell the student, hey, go ask Carlos about this problem. And it was a very interesting conversation for Carlos to unpack what it means for him to fulfill his role in the classroom through interactions if the students don't necessarily want him to be the person that they talk to. And so lastly, Paul interrogated his understanding of what students should be doing in a class for them to learn. And so this goes back to that thing that I mentioned. The student talked about, like just blurted out like one random class. Unfortunately, I wasn't there during that observation. But Paul recollected this idea of words-based math, that a student blurted it out after they were doing some word-based problems. And for Paul, that made him pause, and then we unpacked it because to him and many others in my department, when we talked about this quote, agree that math is word-based. Like it's been word-based. It's always been word-based. Like it's not just symbols. There's words attached to it. And so for us, it was bewildering. But then for the student, it was a chance for Paul to sort of interrogate how he's been approaching this and being able to see the vantage view of his students of, oh, these students are seeing this class as not mathematical in the way that I would assume it be. And so that sort of interrogated him, that forced him, that not forced, that pushed him to interrogate what it means for his students to learn in this classroom. Okay. So other findings about this, across the three of them, they also spoke of the challenging task of having to learn how to teach while also still juggling multiple responsibilities. Now, this isn't really shocking for us because we've been through that sort of idea of we have to juggle multiple things. They're a graduate student taking their own graduate courses, trying to pass their own qualifying exams, and doing X, Y, and Z's. Plus, now they have to worry about this student's learning of mathematics because they gotta take this knowledge elsewhere. And so something that we talked about throughout, not throughout the semesters, but at different points of the semester was the graduate students themselves having to remind themselves that the department told them they're a graduate student first before they're instructors, meaning that they cannot let their graduate student courses, their responsibilities, falter because of the workload of teaching. And there are some like sort of conversations to be had about this in terms of like the department um not providing or like expecting work to be done that isn't in opposition to this statement. Um, and then we've also talked about ways that they survived the first semester of teaching. Paul found that asking for feedback and advice from more senior graduate student instructors or maybe their faculty coordinator um, was really helpful in terms of alleviating that stress of juggling multiple responsibilities. Carlos kept a strong belief that this is what they wanted. This is why they went to grad school. This is why they want to be a professor. They want to be an instructor. They want to help students. And that helped them sort of survive through their first semester of teaching. And Andy found the parts in her teaching that makes her feel more successful. Because I think it's safe for me to say that if you read all of their narratives, Andy was the one who struggled the most, who found the most sort of jarring experience out of all three of them. And so for her, it was really key for her to find the little small parts of her experience that gave her that sort of success, that joy. So this spoke to her journals, how office hours went great. Students came and I was able to talk to them one-on-one, and it seemed like it was a mutually beneficial experience. Or in the classroom, I would notice that she seemed more livelier whenever she was interacting with table groups as opposed to being up front on the lecture board. And so there are these things that they have all done in order to survive. And I think I want to highlight my word choice here in surviving as opposed to ways to get through their first semester. This ties into this idea, and I've been trying to look for this paper, so if somebody can find it, but I like briefly read somewhere where somebody was like their first stage of somebody's teaching development is survival. The next stage is something else, and this is why I can't find it because I can't remember the four stages. But I remember the first stage being survival, and that echoing a lot in my experience as a graduate student instructor myself. I just survived my first semester of teaching. I didn't have ways to improve my teaching. I was just trying to get week by week, like I need to get this lecture done. I need to get this lesson done for students. And so I think it's very key, uh, kind of disheartening that it is like a survival as opposed to like you're just learning something. And so for this one, I've been talking for quite a bit for like 25 minutes straight. And I want us to I want to crowdsource before I tell you what the interesting things that I noticed about these pictures. Um, so again, I need to inform you, I had them grade their week to week in retrospect. Each of them graded their own weeks based on however you want. I can tell you how they each graded them if that is important to you. But I just want you to sort of wander, notice, and relate to these graphs however you want. I'll give you like probably 2 minutes before you share out. It's been a minute and a few seconds. Does anybody feel brave in sharing a curiosity or a noticing? Feel free to just unmute. Peter.
Hey, yeah, I'm noticing like at the midway point, like halfway on the x-axis, there's a drop off in Andy, like a really big drop off. And then also in Carlos at the same point is a little bit of an inflection. And then Paul also had a drop off about halfway. So I'm wondering, was that midterms? Did they get scores back and like think, oh shit, something bad happened with testing for Andy and Paul, and Carlos maybe saw good test scores and was excited.
Hmm. Okay. So I'm gonna tell you for Andy, that dip was because she had made a mistake in the class. And
Mm,
she felt like this is the thing that student the what is the statement? The straw that broke the camel's back. She felt like, oh, my students now realize that I don't know what I'm doing. That this is over. Like now they're not gonna expect me to know anything and they're gonna doubt me and all the things. And so that was her moment. She was like, I feel so horrible because I made a mistake and now students will see that I am a fraud. And this put into turmoil how she sees her teaching. What's actually interesting about Andy is we talked about how, oh, you did this so far out of the semester. If you had asked me to do these week to week during the semester, this would be a lot lower because I actually felt a lot worse. But because it's after the semester, I've been able to sort of think about it some more and kind of get okay with it, like be fine with it. It's still quite a deep like dip. But yeah, so that was for Andy. And for Carlos, this was him talking about how his responsibilities as a graduate student, also as an instructor, started really compounding on him because he was like, I had homeworks due, I had research meetings to go to, and then I also had to prepare for class. And he was talking about how he didn't have as much time to prepare for lecture anymore. And so it felt like to him, his quality of teaching went down because he came to class less prepared. He was less prepared to answer student questions. He was less prepared in giving students connections to the mathematics in their life. So to him, he was grading it in that way. Now for Carlos, the sort of inflection point, like you said in the middle. I think this was just him getting more comfortable with the classroom situation, noticing that his students didn't really want to talk to him, but talk to each other at least. He was able to see more success in having students talk to each other, give presentations to each other. So this was him like sort of flipping the script in his head of like, oh, I am not the person that they're gonna gravitate to, so I should at least have them gravitate to each other. Yeah. What other thoughts do we have about these? Give you 10 more seconds to be brave.
I could share something.
Go ahead.
Well, one thing I noticed is, of course, the up and down that I'm sure many of us experience, whether it's our first time teaching a class or any semester. But one thing I noticed is a drop off for everybody at the beginning or shortly after the beginning. I guess for Paul, it was a little bit longer, although Paul labeled it in a different way. So I'm not sure if those were exactly equal durations or not.
Mhm.
But that's one thing that I noticed is how a lot of them started more positive and then did have a pretty notable dip.
Mhm. So to explain Paul's missing first point, uh, it's because he just didn't read the instructions and didn't grade week 0. And so I was like, okay, sure, I'm not gonna ask you to do that on the spot. Um, but yeah, so that is something to notice that something that I noticed is either they started and ended in the same level like Carlos did, or they ended the semester worse than how they started. I mean, to be fair, Paul was just one more less. Andy's sort of the more pronounced one, which is why I said that if you read their narratives, you would notice that Andy was the one who was really challenged out of the three of them. Something that my reader noticed before, and this was one of the comments that I had to address for my dissertation, is the dips happen randomly, right? Not randomly. I shouldn't say random. Random has a statistical definition. Unpredictable manner. And so one of the faculty members that was in the dissertation defense actually pointed out how this is an important thing for us to notice and how it's an important message to the department that unpredictable dips like this happen for graduate students, not just the instructors. And so this is perhaps a good motivator for us to check in with our graduate students throughout the semester, not just like month to month, not just at the end of the semester, because at that point they'll probably have forgotten the trauma that happened. So it's good to check in, and that's sort of the thing that I wanted to talk about for this slide. Okay. Now, like I said, this was supposed to be a results and reflections type of talk. And so I want to reflect on my work with mathematics graduate students instructors. So I initially framed this work for myself and also for my committee that if we better understand how to support math graduate student instructors, then the undergrads will benefit from it. And this is sort of the framing that I had. This was how I framed like the first chapter of my dissertation to introduce the problem. But since, joining this group and then attending the sort of working group that we had at Room, interrogating this sort of framing as like, why do we do grad research and graduate mathematics education? It's because we want to improve it just for the graduate mathematics students' experiences rather than it being a byproduct or a means to an end. That should be the goal. And the improvement on undergrad should be the secondary effect, as opposed to it being the goal. And so this is just something that I wanted to highlight, and it's sort of like a shift that I've had because of the group that we have here. And then I also want to talk about this idea of being a near peer. So a near peer is an individual who is often able to be seen by the mentees as one step ahead. And so this is a recent thing that was happening because I think for Wilson and Gregorian, they were looking at high school and college. So high school seniors looking to their near peer mentors in their college, in the undergrad institution as being one step ahead of them. So therefore they get mentored into filling in their application. What does it mean to study for the SAT? And all of these things that help them sort of get to that next step. I couldn't find any models or any even discussions of stuff like this with near peer mentoring. There are like the Elite PD program. There's other like professional developments for graduate students in math that is happening recently. But I couldn't find anything about this idea of near peer mentoring in the context of graduate students instructors, or not just instructors, just as a graduate students in math. And when I pointed this out in my dissertation in the final chapter, one of my readers actually pointed out that this is a good thing for us to study. We should look into the ways that we mentor students because at my institution we have a graduate student mentoring program where graduate students who have passed their qualifying exams, which is our preliminary exams for some institutions, because we have the quals and then we have the comprehensives, as opposed to the prelims and then the qualifying. So this is their first batch of exams. Once you finish those, you get to be a mentor for a first year graduate student. And nobody's ever asked if this is working well. We just kind of do it because it's nice. You get to connect with the first years, you get to help them out, and all these things. You get to add on to the CV that you have mentorship experience. So there's these good things about it. But nobody's ever asked the question until I brought it up of like, is this a good model? Are we doing good? Or is this just harming people? And like, taking up more space for that senior grad student to be stressed because now they have to also worry about this other grad student, right? Like these questions haven't been asked, and there was interest in exploring this at my institution. And then the other last thing that I was sort of reflecting on with my research here is the observations that I did, the journaling that I had them do, the interviews, all sort of, in my opinion, help vent out feelings and frustration and thoughts regarding the experience of teaching for the first time. And for me, this really helped sort of alleviate this idea of stressing out about your teaching. Um, I did also have a little bit of like a self-reflection in my dissertation about this idea where I thought I was avoiding the idea of positivist view of you cannot influence the data that you're collecting. But then like in reflection, I was like, maybe I should have leaned in further into this idea of being a near peer. Because I was like 2 years ahead of these students. I had finished my qualifying exams. I finished my comprehensive exams. I was far ahead. I've taught for a bit. And so maybe I should have leaned into that idea of I'm helping these people understand what it means to teach. But instead, I kind of just kept my mouth shut sometimes because I'm like, oh, don't want to talk about that because it's going to influence how they see their frames, or oops, can't talk about that because it's going to influence this or that. And so there were that moment where I was like, I really can't influence the data. But then I think that's something for us to sort of interrogate of just like, what is it that we're doing and how can we help them? And this ties into the ethical considerations that I want to talk about alongside the idea of this graduate student bill of rights. So on the research side of things, again, tying back to the thing that I just said, I want to avoid and also be mindful of conducting parasitic research on graduate students. I know that this is sort of like the thing that we're doing, um, but graduate students are already going through a lot, not just in math, but in every subject. So be mindful and always have that sort of idea of what are they getting out of this research, right? Um, and I would like to think that me extending that sort of conversation to them help them sort of unpack some stuff. So hopefully I sort of help remediate that idea of parasitic research. And then now, oh, I did have two. Never mind. I came up with one last minute. For the development of, so I was thinking of the Student Bill of Rights as in part of like supporting the idea of developing as a graduate student, because that was what my dissertation about. That's what I can speak to. So the first one that I sort of came up with is this idea of the right of the graduate student to be formally mentored in being a student, a researcher, and an instructor from the start of their graduate journey. I added that in bold because to me, at my institution, you don't get an advisor until you finish your qualifying exam. You have a pre-advisor who is just kind of there to make sure that you turn in your forms, you get a master's degree, you talk about the classes that you're taking, but it's not necessarily a mentoring platform for you to ask questions about like, hey, I'm really struggling about my homework or like taking these classes. I need some guidance on that. And that's sort of where the grad mentoring program comes in. The more senior graduate student comes in and like helps them. Um, and then, but it's only when you get to your advisor after you passed your qualifying exams, and if an advisor says yes to you, do you actually get formally mentored in being a researcher. And perhaps you also get mentored in taking classes and being a student and like being studious because they have to help you pass your comprehensive exams. But I have rarely seen a sort of formal mentoring program as an instructor. And Elite PD is sort of like that thing that comes up in my head is like, this is a way for us to have a formal way of professional developing as instructors. And so I think this is my sort of like suggestion. If we were to craft a Bill of Rights, I think this is one that I would fight for. Um, and I have the data to back up why it's important for us to do this right from the start. I have it as right from the start of their instructor career, but I didn't do it as the first year. That's something I forgot to mention. Their second years when they first start teaching. And then I added this last minute, I guess. I don't remember writing it. The right of the graduate student to have a space to bravely discuss questions and issues with regards to being a student, a researcher, and an instructor. So just, I think I was just reflecting back on the last slide of this idea of I provided them a space for them to talk about stuff that was bothering them, that was weighing them down. And I'm not entirely sure if this is something that if we were to give this to a math department, that they would be like, okay, sure. or they would just like scoff at that and being like, we have that. Of course we have that. They can talk to us about anything, whatever they want, right? But sort of these are the two things that came up from my research and my experience that I think I have enough of quote unquote evidence to show that this is an important thing to have. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. We can discuss stuff now if you'd like. Let me know if you want me to go back to any slides, any questions you have. Also, for the people who missed it in the beginning, I'm waiting for my dissertation to be published on the open access website before I send out the link through the RGME listserv. But when that's out, then you get to read the narratives that I skipped over.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the narratives? What does that look like?
Um, I didn't really have, so narrative inquiry is very free form. I didn't try to do like a poem or an art space kind of approach. I just kind of went through the story of we talked in the beginning of the semester or before the semester. This is how they talked about their teaching. This is how they talked about their students learning. Now let's head into the first day of class. How did their first day of class went? And then I sort of try to draw a storyline that kind of crafts this sort of picture of what is happening to their role, like any significant moments throughout the semester that was happening. So for I actually don't know if this made it into the story or not. So y'all are getting a sneak peek. But for Andy, one situation in the classroom was the classroom was really rowdy during my observation and during what happened to also be a more senior faculty coordinator was in the classroom observing Andy's teaching to give her comments. But the classroom was really loud. You could barely hear Andy. And so the other observer actually stood up and said, "Hey, can't hear Andy. So can everybody please be quiet?" And that was like a moment that happened. And I think it was a moment that sort of shifted Andy's perspective of what is it that she has student to do in the classroom. And one part of that is being able to ask students to, hey, please focus. I am telling you, I'm trying to teach you something, right? And so those moments are sort of like highlighted within the narratives. And then the after the semester is just us talking about, okay, what would you like to do in the future? What are the things that we saw in the semester that you want to unpack some more? And so yeah.
Hey, good
Hi.
job. Congratulations on turning in your dissertation. And I think you said you defended too.
Yes.
Awesome. Sorry that I was late.
You're good.
But great work. And I have a question. The graph that you showed, I noticed something, but I kind of missed what they were recording, like how they felt about their teaching across the semester, how they felt
Mhm.
overall about their graduate experience across the semester.
Oh.
And
So
then, uh-huh.
this was very free form. I did not tell them
Ah,
like you need to grade about this. Each of
right.
them decided in their own way what they wanted to talk about. So
Mm-hmm.
Andy talked about mostly her experience teaching. It was
Mm-hmm.
very much focused on her teaching stuff. Paul was more talking about me holistically. How was I feeling throughout the week as a graduate student? And on top of also being an instructor, which is why there's a dip there. It's not necessarily that his teaching went bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's just him being like, I have so many responsibilities happening at the moment that I feel really bad. I can't remember off the top of my head how Carlos graded. I think this was also a very teaching focused sort of grading,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't tell them. I just told them, go through your semester week by week, assign a numerical score to it, and then draw a line connecting the dots.
So one thing that I noticed is that for Carlos and Paul, that their starting and end scores are in the same place, which to me like indicates like a certain level of um a consistency. I want to say like persist. I'm trying to find the right word, but
Mhm.
some stability, right, in how they, I don't know, view their experience across the semester. And so that kind of like lines up with what you said, like Andy sort of like maybe had more challenges, especially related to their teaching. I
Mhm.
wonder how like these graphs sort of related to your narrative analysis, and if you were able to highlight like the graphs as you did the narrative analysis, or what that kind of looks like in your dissertation.
Uh, so I put the graphs in the after semester section, and it was mostly just me talking about how like, hey, this aligned with some stuff that we talked about throughout the stories that I told you in the during the semester. Like Paul encountering what he called a mid-semester slump is right there in the picture. He drew the picture for me because that's the mid-semester slump. And then Carlos talking about how so one of the reasons why he started dipping down is because we kept talking about this student who dropped the class because they could not how do I form this? The student asked Carlos to do something that would be doable if it was just one student. But then Carlos thought that the thing that the student was asking for, which is to grade the workbook that they work on during class, would be unfair if only one student got that treatment. And so he was like, I either have to do it for all 25 of my students, which would be a time sink, or I say no to the student. And they told the student no, and then the student ended up dropping the class. And so Carlos sort of like started thinking like, I am losing track of what it means to help students and all these things. And so that appears in the narrative also. And so I am actually curious to if I were ever to do this kind of study again, if I want to do a week to week version and then have them do a picture at the end without looking at the original picture, like let like 3 months pass by so they forget about it, and then
Yeah.
ask them to draw the picture and see how that compares. But yeah, Andy was the one person who talked about how if you ask me to do this during the semester, this would be a more lower shifted graph. And I was like, oh, interesting.
This is interesting. Oh, but I have one more comment. I don't know if folks here remember or were at the talk at Room. It was like Anne Cowley and some of her grad students, and they talked about like speed bumps and boosters, and then like catastrophes, I think was what. And so those some of these like your graphs are kind of reminding me of that. And then I also saw that in my own dissertation work where some of my participants like it's not that bad things didn't happen or challenges didn't happen, but for some of the students, they were able to like sort of weather those speed bumps. And for other students, there were more like catastrophic events that happened.
So I think perhaps what is something that I probably should have talked about, but I didn't want to sort of influence your sort of view of these students, is Andy came to the PhD program straight from undergrad. Carlos came to this PhD program from a master's program. Paul came to this PhD program also straight from undergrad, but their undergrad journey was non-traditional. They finished later. So Carlos and Paul are older than Andy in the sense of both in the education realm and also in the age realm. So I think this idea of weathering those speed bumps might be because of that, but I didn't want to like speak to that because I don't think I have a strong argument in that sense. Because they never mentioned their age. They never mentioned like, oh, it's because I'm like, I came straight from undergrad, which is why I'm having such a terrible time.
I have one more thing to say. Does anyone else have something to add before I keep going? Okay. I wonder if what what are the genders of the participants, and did they mention like their gender at all? Like I know for me as a woman teaching, it can be really challenging and like sometimes don't like feel like I initially get like respect. And so like classroom management can be challenging. So I was just wondering if if you saw any of that.
They did not ever mention any of them. So Andy is a female student. Carlos and Paul are both male students. Carlos and Paul never mentioned their gender. Carlos did mention his identity as somebody who took math, like this algebra class in a different country. But that was like a really short mention. Andy was the person who didn't talk about gender in the way that you're talking about, in that sense of, oh, people are viewing me as not confident or not able to do this job. Andy talked about it in the sense of, I am a white woman, a privileged white woman who got to go to college without having to worry about paying for it. And so I had it in the mindset that I went to college because I wanted to be here, not because I needed to be here. Like I could have lived life fine without a college degree. So that's how she talked about her gender. But we never talked about it in the sense of, do you feel like you feel unconfident about this job because you see a gender dynamic here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's super interesting though too. Thank you.
Mhm. Right.
I wanted to start by saying that I really enjoy a lot of this.
Uh-huh.
Well, first of all, I'm a little biased because I enjoy narrative inquiry and have used it before. So I do like stories. And it was fun to see these, especially in the context of graduate students. Actually, maybe I'll pick your brain sometime because I'm working on putting together a narrative inquiry of grad student stories of theorizing in the future, math ed grad students. So you might have some ideas about how I could think about that. But what I really appreciated the most about your talk and your framing was how you gave so much space for the students to decide where to take things, like what the score means and things like that. I think that's really important, not only in graduate education, but just in general. It's something that I really care about in my work, to ethically give students the space to define the constructs that matter to them. Of course, we narrow in the focus to some degree, but I really appreciated how you left that open-ended, and also in the narrative inquiry too. Really quickly, have you came across Ronnie Satyam and colleagues' ESM paper that was from a few years ago on affect graphing? It's a methodology piece. You might consider, I can send it to you. I just pulled it up. You might consider looking at it. It has methodological comments about graphing affect dimensions, and your thing is teaching and learning, but it has similarities, I think, where you're allowing students to define that. Anyway, I also know Aida Alabek has been using a similar method and has been developing the methodological chunks and presenting on it at Room. So maybe there will be a time to connect up with her. I also wanted to get towards your second suggested right of a graduate student. I really appreciated how you reflected on the ethical dimensions of how you were doing the work. I think that near peer commentary was really useful and important for us, especially since a lot of us are near peers for graduate students at various stages. I mean, just without even trying, we probably have at least one person that we serve that role for. But specifically on your second right around the right of the grad student to have space to bravely discuss questions and issues with regard to being a student, researcher, or an instructor. So the way I think about this, and this is something that I really care about too, I would second something like this, is attending holistically to students' identities, and the fact that you can't really disentangle these. I mean, you alluded to it. Students are balancing these multiple roles that lean into multiple identities. This is how I got into thinking about Archie and me originally, like maybe 7 years ago now, when I did my first trial run of research in a qualitative inquiry class. I was observing and doing an ethnography, at least that's how I pitched in the beginning, of a GTA professional development space. And one of my biggest findings, I actually did position myself eventually, not in the beginning, kind of like you, but as a near peer to the grad students that were there. I was, I think, a fourth year at that time, and many of us were in the same office, but I was observing this space, and I had taught, and I had institutional knowledge and things like that. And one of the biggest things that I learned is some of these GTA PD spaces can be really powerful opportunities, not just for thinking about identities related to teaching, but some of these other things. So that leads me to the question of, I've also created for math ed grad students kind of a holistic reflection space in my last doc program. And honestly, that's really what led me here, is realizing how powerful those spaces are and the need to create them because they don't always exist. My question to you, oh, we might have run out of time. Darn it. But my question, I guess I'll pose it open-ended, and if you have to go and other people have to go, that's fine. But my question is wondering what those spaces look like and what are the components of those spaces I mean, I know on the Bill of Rights, we probably wouldn't super specify that, but in thinking about that, you're making me wonder about the nature of those spaces and how flexible do they need to be and who are in those spaces. And is it the same space for everybody? Yada, yada, yada. There's a lot of questions there. But I've said enough things. Thanks for sharing your work. I look forward to continuing to talk with you about it.
Yeah. I think that's why I don't feel as strongly as the other, right? It's just I don't have the evidence in scare quotes to be able to talk more about like what does that look like? What does this look like? I was mostly talking about like I was able to provide a one-on-one space with this person. There was a person that was sitting with me, Royce, and other people that was also talking about forming uh, a community of grad students and like talking about with each other. I forgot their name. I know they work with Adi, but they were also looking at that. So maybe that's somebody to also sort of think about this idea. What does it look like for graduate students to have that space? Is it a physical space? Is it a seminar space? Is it X, Y, and Z? But yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much though for coming. I do have to leave. So yeah.
Thanks, Johan. That was great.
Yeah,
Johan.
thank you.
I will see everybody when I see everybody.